This woman looks like a person of color. She acts like a person of color. She teaches a class about persons of color. She has presented herself as an Afro-Latina for nearly a decade. But when on September 3rd, Jessica Krug revealed in an essay that she is of white Jewish ancestry, George Washington University decided she would not teach classes for the upcoming semester, and Krug later resigned. A CNN article claims that
Krug lied about her identity.
But she didn't. Y'all can scream about cultural appropriation all you want, but Jessica Krug is black. Alright, let's get the full picture here. The full GWU statement on Jessica Krug says,
"The discipline of history is concerned with truth-telling about the past. With her conduct, Dr. Krug has raised questions about the veracity of her own research and teaching."
My best interpretation is that by telling the truth about the past, they are referring to Krug's past as in her ancestry. But the insistence that an individual be defined by their ancestors is absolutely regressive. And the idea that Krug's research is any less accurate because she's ancestrally white can only hinge on the idea that the author's subjective racial experience is of inherent value. But assigning value to people's ideas and experiences based purely on their skin color or ancestry is kind of the definition of racism. Dr. Krug's official statement reminds me of the internalized false confessions of a person who is convinced she is responsible for a crime. She states,
"I have not only claimed these identities as my own when I had absolutely no right to do so, when doing so is the very epitome of violence, of thievery and appropriation, of the myriad ways in which non-black people continue to use and abuse black identities and cultures. My continued appropriation of a black Caribbean identity is not only, in the starkest terms, wrong, it's unethical, immoral, anti-black, colonial."
Cultural appropriation is a concept based purely in emotional reaction. You cannot steal an element of culture from anybody because culture does not belong exclusively to one group. There's no copyright for black people. In no way can a fucking hairstyle communicate racism for whites, nor are blacks who straighten their hair race traitors. To give groups of people different rights based on the way they were born is segregation. Besides, so many American cultural elements from slang to rock and roll have come from black culture that if we tried to do that, freedom of thought and expression would be tossed right out the window. I think our appropriation of culture speaks to the importance of the black community to the broader American culture, but some of us prefer to sit around and bitch. Again, cultural appropriation is a segregationist talking point, intended to divide and box people into categories to which they were assigned at birth. Nobody should be defined by their skin color, and if we're to allow anybody to reject their own race in favor of individuality, reserving for certain races what we can and can't do flies in the face of cultural liberation. Dr. Krug continues,
"Intention never matters more than impact. To say that I clearly have been battling some unaddressed mental health demons for my entire life as both an adult and a child is obvious."
This statement is not only unbased, but fundamentally dangerous. When we're talking about impact over intention, we're not talking about consequentialism here. We're talking about a presupposition that an acceptance of transracialism would bring more harm than confining transracials to their cultural norms. The comparison here is whether the harm of offending racial gatekeepers is greater than the restriction of the ability of individuals to freely express themselves. The answer here is obviously no. To offend the sensibilities of social conservatives is unavoidable. To please everyone is impossible. The freedom of anybody to act, express, and identify how they want to is infinitely more important than even our urge to protect minorities from real racial trauma. Aren't we the same ones who gave the finger to reactionaries who felt their own gender betrayed by transsexuals? Aren't we the freethinkers who applauded the removal of gender dysphoria from the mental illness lists? To chalk up any identity incongruence to mental illness without adequate research is not only dangerous, but devastating to the lives of members of the LGBT+ community in the past, and possibly others today. We're going to address a comparison between transgenders and transracialism soon, but it's important to know that regardless of whether Dr. Krug really is black, or whether she does indeed suffer from mental illness, personal identity is nothing to be canceled for. And here's where Krug declares,
I believe in restorative justice where possible. I believe in accountability. And I believe in cancel culture as a necessary and righteous tool for those with less structural power to wield against those with more power.
Now I'm starting to think this bitch really is insane. She contradicted herself all in one breath. How can you believe in restorative justice but also cancel culture? Let me be clear here. Punitive justice is an oxymoron. It's a barbaric concept from back in the caveman days where the threat of mutually assured destruction kept the ruling class in power. It's the justice of,
don't fuck with me, cause I'll bash your skull in with a rock.
Those strong-arm tactics have historically given the elite oppressive control over the common man, and now cancel culture is being wielded by racial McCarthyists to ruin lives with minimal accuracy without solving anything. Just think about it. Clearly, the power to cancel still rests with those in power. Cancellation is done by the unthinking masses, the same ones who just a few years ago would have canceled you for being gay. Krug continues,
I have lived this lie fully, completely, with no exit plan or strategy. I have built only this life, a life within which I have operated with a radical sense of ethics of right and wrong, and with rage rooted in black power, an ideology which every person should support, but to which I have no possible claim as my own.
Well, it's written in plain ink now, isn't it? Dr. Krug is a black separatist who wanted to fit in with what she considered a superior race, but has finally come to the insane realization that she can never overcome her ancestry. But barring that, here's a general picture. A woman who has spent her whole life not just posing, but identifying as black, and who for decades was treated as black with no problem whatsoever, is now a racial fugitive in a world where both the fascist right and the pseudo-liberal left play identity politics at the expense of personal freedoms. Cancel culture and our new segregationist pseudo-progressivism has ruined her life, the lives of anybody she knows, and inadvertently, the lives of many people of color who have been traumatized by the prospect of having to live their lives trapped in a culture which often actively contributes to their own victimization. Let me be clear, I'm a race and gender abolitionist. Both concepts are oppressive labels designed to hold individuals to arbitrary and unreasonable standards based on a vague conception that people ought to act in accordance to some strange code buried in their DNA or written into our societal structure. In a world where I am God, transgenders and transracials don't exist because race and gender aren't a thing in the first place. But while we're trapped in our id-Paul hellscape, I'm forced to enter the wondrous land of intersectionality. A couple years back, a peer-reviewed article called In Defense of Transracialism by Rebecca Tuvel was published in feminist philosophy journal Hypocrisy. The essay makes use of a comparison between former NAACP chapter head Rachel Dolezal, an ancestrally European woman who identifies as black, and Caitlyn Jenner, a transgender woman. The article, of course, sparked backlash among many intersectionalists, and almost immediately, an open letter signed by hundreds of university faculty called for the retraction, aka censorship, of the paper. Keep in mind here that the article is in no way malicious, is written by an intersectional feminist, and is, as we'll see, kind of correct. The article essentially focuses on two criteria for gender categorization, namely self-identification and social acceptance, and applies those same categories to race. The social criterion is best summarized as, if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, call it a duck. The criteria aren't really objectionable, so we need to determine the strength of the analogy between race and gender. First, race and gender both have a biological component. Gender is correlated with sex and some other genetic and epigenetic factors. Race is correlated with ancestry. Importantly though, there are no significant genetic distinctions between races as there are for sexes. Second, neither race nor gender exist. That is, they are both social constructs built to quickly categorize people into various categories without having to learn about each individual's unique characteristics. In other words, they're intuitive stereotypes. And as I, along with some other feminists, would argue, these stereotypes are harmful not just to women and minorities, but all people to varying degrees. A corollary of the culturally constructed nature of race and gender is that we as a society can change them or destroy them completely. So the important point here is to separate the biological and socio-cultural components of each. This is where things get a bit hairier. Gender identity is at least partially determined by biology. Tuvol does address how certain hormonal differences are related to gender identity, suggesting that gender might be poorly understood but immutable nonetheless. Transracialism, of course, cannot have such a biological basis only because distinct races don't genetically exist in any sense of the word. Anyway, it hardly matters whether there is a clear biological indicator for someone's gender identity, because restricting people based on biology is both socially limiting and potentially ignorant of less notable indicators. Even if gender incongruence were caused by external psychological factors, it wouldn't necessarily be any less valid. So if we take this line of reasoning, transracialism is valid. Dr. Tuvol goes on to address 4 objections. First is that
a transracial like Dolezal can't claim a black identity because she didn't grow up with a black experience.
That's already a strange statement because first, there is not one black experience. Blacks endure varying levels of racism. Hell, it's conceivably possible that a black might never have experienced racism in their lifetimes. But even granting that blacks should be treated as a monolith, which is a regressive idea, I don't see why it matters. Dolezal has passed as a light-skinned black for years, and presumably has experienced racism that's come along with it. And in comparison to transgenders, some of them experienced no sexism or transphobia before they transitioned either. A second objection is that
Posing as a black woman harms actual black people.
a comparison here is made to blackface. But let me just say it, blackface is not necessarily racist. If a white man comes out of the mines with soot on his face, that would not be racist. When Asians lighten their skin with foundation, that's not racist. Blackface is only racist when it's meant to mock minorities. It's the difference between transgender women and drag queens. Is Dolezal doing that? I think not. If anything, the fact a white-born woman wants to identify as black is kind of a compliment. A racist, anti-white compliment. The final objection listed in the article is that
A white person turning black is a condescending use of white privilege.
Tuvol's response is that
A transgender woman would also supposedly be exercising male privilege to descend down to female.
though this is sound reasoning, I'm gonna depart from Tuvol's response for a sec because I believe the concept of privilege is deeply flawed. Believe it or not, there exist female privileges and even black privileges. In fact, I'd argue that Dolezal wants to be black because she believes the advantages of being black, few as they may seem to intersectionalists, outweigh the disadvantages of racism. The less cynical Tuvol speculates the inverse, that
Dolezal is not exercising her privilege, but forfeiting it by turning black.
it's kind of weird for us to say,
No, you're not allowed to give up your privilege.
like, at this point, aren't you just reinforcing the systems of inequality you're constantly whining about? And how come the supposedly privileged one is having her actions restricted? Alright, so in all, Tuvol's article is pretty solid, at least in its arguments, but evidently, it's not pure enough for the cackling cunts who signed the open letter to Hypatia. These are the letter's criticisms.
It uses vocabulary and frameworks not recognized, accepted, or adopted by the conventions of the relevant subfields.
Great. We're starting off strong, aren't we, with a bunch of semantic arguments. I don't give a flying fuck about what we call something as long as we're clear about what we mean by it. Does Dr. Tuvol display any malicious intent? No? Great, let's move on.
It fails to seek out and sufficiently engage with scholarly work by those who are most vulnerable to the intersection of racial and gender oppressions.
Well, here it is. Instead of engaging with the actual arguments presented in the essay, they instead resort to ad hominem attacks. The complaint that not enough women of color were cited implies that a person's ideas are somehow more valid if they have black skin or a pussy. This requirement of personal experience would never be acceptable in any other field. Imagine if we had a jury of all black ex-cons deciding a police brutality case. Or imagine asking a bunch of Muslims whether the burqa is an oppressive garment. Imagine asking a billionaire about tax policy because he's affected more by them. Personal experience does not equal academic expertise. If anything, it introduces bias to the system and should be minimized whenever possible. But when it comes to identity politics, suddenly it becomes the most important thing in the world.
Everybody shut up and listen. The short, ugly, fat, left-handed, disabled, transgender, dark-skinned Jew is sharing how she's completely defined by her identity, and we should not only listen and believe her struggles unquestioningly, but also feel bad for what privilege we have for not being those things.
Am I exaggerating? Yeah. But too often, intersectionality has become a caricature of itself, and that's frustrating. We agree that gender and race are labels that inevitably restrict freedom. My solution is to get rid of those categories, but a lot of intersectionalists choose to instead reaffirm these oppressive labels, inadvertently supporting right-wing concepts that actually hinder progress towards social liberation. What's worse, the discriminatory talking points echoed by college-educated, quasi-progressives just serve as ammunition for conservatives. By allowing neo-fascists to reframe identity politics as left-wing, we're helping feed reactionaries into the anti-intellectual alt-right pipeline, which woke scolds actually share much more in common with than true progressives. We have to start calling it like it is. Neo-segregationism is a betrayal of everything anti-tribalistic progressives ought to stand for. Fuck race, fuck gender, fuck social expectations, and fuck cancel culture. My schedule has become quite packed, so in case you missed my channel announcement a few weeks ago, I'll be slowing my video productions to once a week. This is subject to further change, but I'm hoping to work up a backlog so I can have videos to release even when I have no time to work on them. Stay tuned, download my soundtrack for free, and bye.
I'm and I approve this message.